I stood in that courtroom only a few feet from my own children, and neither of them could look at me. Daniel kept his gaze locked on the table. Emily stood with her arms folded, as if I were someone she had never known. Across the room, my husband, Richard Sanders, sat calm and composed, almost pleased with himself, as though the outcome had already been decided. For months, he had fed them lies about me, and they had believed him. But there was one thing Richard did not understand. That day, I wasn't there to argue with him. I was there to let the truth speak for itself. And once Daniel and Emily heard it, our family would never be the same again. Before I take you back to how it all began, please subscribe to Truth and Dignity Stories, like this video, and leave a comment. Have you ever had someone you loved make you question your own memory or your own heart? If you had met us 10 years earlier, you might have thought Richard and I had the kind of marriage people quietly admired. My name is Martha Sanders. I was 58 years old then, and I had been married to Richard for more than 30 years. We lived in a modest but lovely house outside Columbus, Ohio. There was a white fence around the yard, a wide maple tree out front, and every October, its leaves turned the color of old gold. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their porches, brought soup when someone was sick, and remembered birthdays without being reminded. For a long time, I believed our life was safe. Richard worked in financial management. He was organized, polished, and respected. People trusted him with their money, their private concerns, even their opinions. He knew how to sound reasonable. He knew how to sit still, listen carefully, and say exactly the right thing at exactly the right time. I had been a nurse. I loved caring for people. I loved the long shifts, the tired feet, the quiet moments when a frightened patient finally relaxed because someone had taken the time to explain what was happening. But when Daniel was born, my life began to change. I still remember holding him for the first time. He was so small that his whole hand wrapped around one of my fingers. I remember looking down at him and thinking, this is my real life now. I did not leave nursing overnight. At first, I reduced my shifts. Then I worked part-time. Then Emily came along 4 years later. And gradually, I became the person who was always home. Lunch boxes, parent-teacher conferences, doctor appointments, school projects, late-night fevers, birthday parties, forgotten gym shoes. Every small, invisible thing that keeps a family moving forward. That was me. And at the time, I did not resent it. Richard came home every evening, loosened his tie, and sat down at the dinner table while I served the food. The children would run to him, eager to tell him about their day. He would smile, nod, and sometimes look at me with approval. "You've done a wonderful job with them, Martha," he would say. Back then, those words felt like enough. Daniel grew into a quiet, responsible young man. He studied engineering, found a good job, and called on Sundays. He had Richard's steady manner, but when he was younger, he also had my softness. He was the kind of boy who once carried an injured bird home in a shoebox because he was afraid it would freeze outside. Emily was different. She was expressive, emotional, and full of questions. When she was little, she would sit on the kitchen counter while I cooked and tell me everything: her friends, her worries, her dreams, the tiny dramas of school that felt enormous to her at the time. People used to tell us, "You two are like best friends." And I believed them. We had traditions: Sunday dinners, Christmas mornings with cinnamon rolls, summer barbecues under the maple tree. Richard grilled hamburgers. Daniel complained that the burgers were too dry. Emily always stole the first ear of corn before anyone else could sit down. From the outside, We were stable, predictable, happy. But when I look back now, I see something I did not understand then. I was the one holding everything together. If the house felt peaceful, it was because I worked to keep it that way. If the children felt loved, it was because I made sure they were heard. If Richard appeared to be a devoted husband and father, it was because I carried the quiet work behind the scenes. I never called it sacrifice. I called it love. But love can become dangerous when only one person is expected to keep giving it. After enough years, the work becomes invisible, and invisible things are easy for others to erase. The first moment I noticed something changing was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed door, no cruel accusation. It happened during an ordinary family dinner. Daniel had come over for the evening, and Emily was visiting too. I had made roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, the meal they both loved when they were growing up. At some point, we started laughing about an old memory. Emily had spilled grape juice on the living room carpet when she was 6, then cried for nearly an hour because she thought I would be angry. You were terrified of me. I teased her gently. You kept saying you were sorry before I had even opened my mouth. Emily smiled a little, but Richard leaned back in his chair and said, Well, Martha, you could be pretty hard on them sometimes. His voice was casual, almost light. Still, something in the room shifted. I laughed, because I did not know what else to do. Hard on them, I said. I was the one who stayed up all night with them when they were sick. Richard gave a small shrug. Sure, but you had your moments. Daniel nodded slightly, not fully agreeing with him, not exactly defending me either. Emily looked down at her plate. That dinner stayed with me for days. It was not only what Richard had said, it was how easily the others accepted it. How quickly a small comment became something believable, like he had planted a seed in the middle of the table and trusted it would grow. I told myself I was being too sensitive. Every family had disagreements. Every parent made mistakes. Maybe Richard was only remembering things differently. Then, a week later, Emily called me. We were talking about something from her childhood when she suddenly said, almost cautiously, You were kind of strict. Mum. I paused. I was? I mean, Dad always said you worried too much. She continued. Not in a bad way. Just, sometimes you could be intense. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the window over the sink. Your dad said that? I asked. She hesitated. You know how he is. He notices things. I did not argue with her. But after we hung up, I stayed in that kitchen for a long time. Richard had never said those things directly to me. Not once. Yet suddenly, I was hearing them through my children. That was when doubt entered my life. Not loudly. Quietly. Had I really been too strict? Too controlling? Too emotional? I started going back through old memories, examining every rule I had made, every bedtime I had enforced, every time I had said no. Was I remembering myself honestly? Or had I been the mother Richard was now describing? At that point, I still believed it was a misunderstanding, a rough patch, a strange change that would eventually pass. I had no idea that Richard was slowly rewriting my entire story, one conversation at a time. After that dinner, Richard never apologized. He did not mention his comment again. Instead, he began correcting me. At first, it was over small things. One afternoon, Emily and I were talking about a family vacation in Florida. I mentioned that she had gotten sick on the second day of the trip. Richard was sitting in his armchair, scrolling through his phone. Without looking up, he said, No, Martha, that was the third day. I frowned. I'm almost certain it was the second. He shook his head slowly. You always mix things like that up. It was the third day. Emily hesitated, then said, I think Dad's right. I let it go. But it kept happening. I would remember a conversation, and Richard would calmly tell me that I had it wrong. That isn't what happened. You're exaggerating again. You always make things sound more serious than they were. It was never a screaming match. He did not need to raise his voice. His calmness was part of what made it so unsettling. At first, I questioned myself. I was getting older. Maybe my memory was not perfect. Maybe I had become more anxious than I realized. But I started noticing a pattern. Richard only corrected me in front of Daniel or Emily. One evening, Daniel mentioned the time he had skipped class in high school. I smiled at him. You mean when you missed school and I grounded you for a week? Richard gave a quiet laugh. No. Martha, you blew that situation way out of proportion. He was late to one class. Daniel shifted in his chair. Mom, it wasn't that serious, he said. You used to panic about stuff. Panic. That word hurt more than I expected. I had been cautious. I had been responsible. The school had called me. I had worried because that was what mothers did. But now, my concern was being described as panic. My boundaries were being described as control. That night, I lay awake beside Richard, staring into the dark. I replayed conversation after conversation, trying to understand what was true. Then I began to notice other things. Richard started calling Daniel and Emily more often. He would leave the room to speak to them privately. He became unusually interested in their personal lives, their relationships, their work stress, their fears. At first, I thought it was a good thing. Richard had always loved them, but he had never been the emotional parent. I was the one who had sat through tears, listened to worries, and stayed awake, waiting for them to come home safely. Now he was suddenly the one offering advice, and I was becoming the problem. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store and found Richard in the kitchen with Emily. Their voices stopped the moment I walked in. Emily looked uncomfortable. Richard smiled at me. Everything okay? I asked. Of course, he said. Emily was just telling me she's been feeling overwhelmed. I set the grocery bags down. Why didn't she tell me? Emily looked at the floor. Richard answered for her. She didn't want you to worry. The words were gentle, but they cut. I turned to Emily. You know you can always talk to me. I know, she said quietly. Richard stepped closer to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Your mother means well, he said. She just gets emotional. I stared at him. He said it as if I were not standing there, as if I were a subject they were discussing instead of a person they loved. That was the first time I felt something colder than confusion. Fear. A few weeks later, Emily stopped answering my calls as quickly as she used to. Daniel's Sunday calls became shorter. They still spoke to me, but there was distance in their voices. They would ask if I was sleeping well. They would ask if I had been feeling stressed. Once, Daniel said, Dad thinks you might need to talk to someone. I remember gripping the phone so tightly that my fingers hurt. Talk to someone about what? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. About everything, he said. You seem upset a lot lately. I wanted to ask him who had told him that, but I already knew. Richard had started using concern as a weapon. He was not telling them I was dangerous. That would have been too obvious. He was telling them I was fragile, confused, overwhelmed, too emotional to see things clearly. And because he said it calmly, because he said it like a worried husband and father, they believed him. The final break came on a rainy Thursday in November. I had been sorting through old papers in Richard's home office. I was looking for our property tax records. when I found a folder tucked behind a stack of financial binders. The folder had no label. Inside were printed emails. At first, I assumed they were work documents, but then I saw my name. One email was from Richard to Daniel. "Your mother has been struggling more than she admits. Please be patient with her. Don't argue with her when she gets upset. It only makes her spiral." Another was sent to Emily. "I know she can be difficult. I'm trying to protect you both from the stress of it." My hands began to shake. There were more. Messages about me forgetting things. Messages claiming I had become unpredictable. Messages suggesting I was isolating myself. Messages making it sound as if Richard had been quietly carrying the burden of a wife who was no longer stable. But that was not the worst part. At the bottom of the folder was a printed message to an attorney. Richard had written that he wanted to discuss legal options regarding marital separation, finance, and the possibility of emotional instability affecting family relationships. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I sat down in his desk chair because my knees would not hold me. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a few careless comments. Richard was building a case against me. He was not only trying to turn my children away from me, he was preparing to take control of the life I had spent 30 years building. And for the first time, I understood exactly why he had been so calm. He thought I would never see it coming. He thought I would stay quiet. He thought I would doubt myself until there was nothing left of me to defend. But as I sat in that office with the rain tapping against the window, something inside me finally changed. I stopped asking whether I was overreacting. I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. And I began saving every piece of evidence I could find. Because my husband had spent months trying to convince my children that I had lost my mind, what he did not realize was that I had just found proof that he had been planning it all along. For the next 2 days, I acted as if nothing had changed. That was the hardest part. Every time Richard walked into the room, every time he asked whether I wanted coffee, every time he spoke in that smooth, ordinary voice, I had to remind myself that the man standing in front of me had written private messages designed to make our children doubt my mind. He had told them I was unstable. He had told them I was difficult. He had made himself look like the patient husband, quietly burdened by a wife who could no longer be trusted. And he had done it carefully enough that I almost doubted what I had read. Almost. I did not confront him that night. I did not wave the folder in his face or ask him why he had betrayed me. Instead, I put every document back exactly where I found it. Then I went downstairs, opened the old cedar chest in our living room, and took out the small lockbox where I kept our most important papers: the deed to the house, my nursing license, my mother's will, copies of our tax returns, the savings account information that Richard and I had built over 3 decades. I sat on the floor beside that chest until nearly midnight, making a list of everything I needed to protect. At first, my hands would not stop shaking. Then something strange happened. The more I wrote down, the calmer I became. Maybe it was because lists had always made sense to me. In nursing, when a patient was frightened and the room felt chaotic, I learned to focus on what was in front of me. Check the chart. Watch the vitals. Ask the right questions. Do the next necessary thing. Panic could not help anyone. Details could. So I started with the details. The next morning, I opened a new email account from the public library. I forwarded copies of the messages I had found. I took pictures of the documents with my phone, then saved them to a secure folder Richard could not access. After that, I went to the bank. I did not accuse Richard of anything. Not yet. I simply asked to speak privately with a bank representative. Her name was Angela Morris. She was probably in her 40s, with short dark hair and the kind of steady, a patient expression that made you feel less foolish for asking questions. I need to understand my options. I told her, "My husband has been handling most of our accounts, but I want to make sure I can access the information myself." Angela did not look surprised. She did not ask me why I had waited so long. She only nodded and said, "That's a wise thing to do. Mrs. Sanders, let's review what accounts are in both names and what accounts are in your name alone." For almost an hour, she went through everything with me. That was when I learned something I had never known. Richard had opened a line of credit against our home 6 months earlier. The amount was $75,000. I stared at the screen in front of me, unable to understand what I was seeing. "There must be a mistake," I said. Angela turned the monitor slightly toward me. "No, Mom. It shows both account holders were notified electronically." I felt cold from my shoulders down to my hands. I had never received a notice. I had never agreed to it. I had never even heard Richard mention a line of credit. "Was money taken out?" I asked. Angela hesitated for a moment before answering. "Several withdrawals were made," she said carefully. "The records show transfers into a business account." "A business account?" I repeated. She looked at me with concern. "I'm sorry. I assumed you knew." I did not know. By the time I left the bank, I had copies of every statement I could legally request. I sat in my car with the papers on the passenger seat and cried for the first time since finding the folder. Not loudly, not dramatically. I just lowered my head over the steering wheel and cried because 30 years of trust had been reduced to numbers on a page. $75,000. Our house. Our savings. My name attached to debt I had never agreed to. When I finally drove home, I parked around the corner instead of in our driveway. I did not want Richard looking out the window and wondering where I had been. That thought hurt me more than I can explain. I had spent 30 years in that house. I had raised my children there. I had painted Emily's room pale yellow when she was 8 because she said it looked like sunshine. I had stood in Daniel's doorway when he left for college, pretending not to cry until he drove away. And now I was sitting outside my own home, afraid of being seen. That was the moment I understood something important. Richard had not only been trying to control what our children believed about me, he had been trying to make me feel small inside my own life. But I was not small. I had just forgotten that I was allowed to take up space. The following Monday, I met with an attorney named Lisa Harper. She came recommended by a former nurse I had worked with years ago, a woman who had gone through a difficult divorce and told me, "Lisa won't make promises she can't keep, but she will tell you the truth." That was exactly what I needed. Lisa's office was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building downtown. There were no dramatic law books stacked to the ceiling, no polished marble floors, no expensive paintings meant to impress people, just a quiet waiting room, a desk, and a woman in a navy blazer who looked at me directly when I spoke. I brought everything: the emails, the financial statements, the home equity records, the handwritten timeline I had made of Richard's comments, his private conversations with Daniel and Emily, the moments when he had corrected me in front of them. Lisa read without interrupting. When she finished, she folded her hands on the desk. "Martha," she said, "I want to be clear. I can't tell you what Richard intended, but I can tell you there is a pattern here." I waited. "He is creating a written record that frames you as unreliable," she continued. "At the same time, he has taken financial actions you were not informed about. Those two things together are serious." My throat tightened. "Can he take my house?" "Not by simply deciding to," she said. "But we need to protect you immediately. We can request financial disclosures, restrict major asset transfers during the divorce process, and make sure any claims about your mental fitness are addressed with real evidence instead of his opinions." The word divorce sat between us. I had thought it before, of course, but hearing it spoken aloud made everything feel final. For years, I had believed that marriage meant staying, working harder, being more patient, giving someone every possible chance to remember the promises they made. But what do you do when the person beside you is quietly dismantling your life? What should I do? I asked. Lisa leaned forward slightly. Do not sign anything he gives you. Do not move money without legal advice. Keep documenting. And if he brings up your mental health, do not defend yourself emotionally. Ask for specifics. Ask for records. Let facts do the talking. Facts. That word steadied me. For the first time in months, someone was not telling me how I felt. Someone was asking what could be proven. When I got home that afternoon, Richard was waiting in the kitchen. He had made dinner. Pasta with meat sauce. Garlic bread. A salad in the bowl. We usually used for holidays. For one brief second, I almost let myself believe he had sensed something wrong and wanted to repair it. Then I saw the envelope on the table. What's this? I asked. Richard gave me a gentle smile. Just some paperwork. Nothing to worry about. I did not sit down. What kind of paperwork? He exhaled, almost sadly. Martha, I know the last few months have been difficult for you. I think it would help if we made some practical plans. I looked at the envelope but did not touch it. What plans? Financial plans. Medical plans. Things families need to discuss as they get older. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. I'm 58. Richard. Yes, he said softly. And you've been under a lot of stress? There it was. The same careful voice. The same quiet suggestion that I was not capable of understanding my own life. He slid the envelope toward me. Inside were forms for a durable power of attorney. The papers named Richard as the person who would control financial decisions if I became unable to manage them. There was also a document authorizing him to speak with doctors and access private medical information. I felt my heart pounding, but I remembered Lisa's words. Do not defend yourself emotionally. Ask for specifics. Why now? I asked. Richard's smile faded slightly. Because I care about you. No. I said, why now? He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, you've been forgetful. You've been upset. The kids have noticed it too. The kids? I repeated. I'm not trying to hurt you. But you talked to them about me? I talked to them because they were concerned. Concerned about what? Exactly? Richard's jaw tightened. You don't have to make this difficult. The old Martha would have apologized then. The old Martha would have cried. Tried to explain. Tried to convince him that I was still the same woman he had married. But I was beginning to understand that no explanation would satisfy a person who benefited from misunderstanding me. So I placed the envelope back on the table. I'm not signing this, I said. Richard stared at me. For the first time, I saw his calm expression slip. Only for a second, but it was enough. You should think carefully, he said. I have. He stood up from his chair. You're making a mistake. No, I replied. I think I made one a long time ago. I just didn't know it yet. That night, Richard slept in the guest room. The next morning, he barely spoke to me. By Friday, Daniel called. His voice sounded tense. Mom, Dad said you had a bad argument. We disagreed. I said carefully. He says you're refusing to plan for the future. I'm refusing to sign legal papers I was not given time to review. There was silence on the line. Then Daniel said, Mom, why would Dad lie about something like that? The question broke my heart because I could hear how certain he was that Richard would not lie. I had once felt that same certainty. I don't know. Daniel, I said, but I'm asking you not to choose sides until you know everything. He sighed. I just don't want this family to fall apart. Neither did I. I thought. But falling apart and being forced apart were not the same thing. A few days later, Emily came to see me. She stood on the porch with her arms folded, rainwater still clinging to the shoulders of her coat. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Of course." She came inside, but did not take off her coat. That told me everything. She had not come to stay. She had come with a purpose. "Dad said you're trying to make him look like a villain?" she began. I looked at her quietly. "Did he?" "He said you found private emails and twisted what he meant." I did find emails. Emily's eyes filled with frustration. "Mom? He's worried about you." "So any?" I said. She blinked. "What?" "I'm worried about what he's doing. I'm worried about why he took out money against our house without telling me. I'm worried about why he wants me to sign papers giving him control over my finances. And I'm worried that he has been telling both of you I'm unstable instead of speaking to me honestly." Emily looked away. "That doesn't sound like Dad." "I know." "Then why would he do it?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know yet." That was the truth. I did not know whether Richard wanted money, control, revenge, or simply the satisfaction of being the person everyone trusted. Maybe it was all of those things. Emily walked toward the door. "Dad said you'd say things like this," she whispered. I felt my chest tighten. "What things? That he was manipulating us?" She looked at me then, and her expression was full of pain. "He said you would try to make us feel guilty for believing him." I wanted to reach for her. I wanted to tell her I had never stopped loving her, never stopped being her mother, never stopped wishing she could see me clearly. But I knew if I pushed, Richard's words would only become stronger in her mind. So I took a breath. "I won't make you feel guilty," I said. "But I need you to remember something. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to hear more than one version of a story." Emily's eyes filled with tears. Then she left. The door closed softly behind her, and I stood alone in the hallway, listening to the sound of rain against the windows. 2 weeks later, Lisa filed for divorce and requested temporary financial protections, while Richard's undisclosed debt and business transfers were reviewed. Richard responded exactly as Lisa warned me he might. He claimed I was emotionally unstable. He claimed I had become paranoid. He claimed I was trying to isolate him from Daniel and Emily. And then he did something I never expected. He asked the court to order an evaluation of my mental fitness, arguing that my unpredictable behavior made it necessary to determine whether I could responsibly manage marital assets during the separation. When Lisa called to tell me, I sat down slowly at the edge of my bed. For a moment, I could not breathe. Richard had turned every fear I had carried into a legal accusation. Every time I had cried alone in the kitchen, every moment I had doubted myself, every question I had asked after finding his lies. He was using all of it as proof that I was the problem. But Lisa's voice remained calm. "Martha, listen to me," she said. "An accusation is not evidence. And if he has been creating a false narrative, we will show the court the full pattern." I looked out the bedroom window at the maple tree in our front yard. The leaves had begun to fall. For years, I had watched that tree change with every season. I had thought it was permanent because it had always been there. But nothing stays the same forever. Not marriages. Not children. Not the stories people tell about you. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. And before it arrived, I received a message from Daniel. It was only one sentence. "Mom, Dad showed me something, and I think you need to explain it." Attached was a screenshot of an email I had never seen before. An email Richard claimed I had written. And when I read the words, I understood that he had gone further than lies. He had started manufacturing proof. I read Daniel's message 3 times before I could bring myself to open the attachment. The email was addressed to Richard. The sender's name was mine, and the words beneath it were written as if I had typed them myself. I don't know what's wrong with me anymore. Sometimes I think everyone would be better off if I disappeared for a while. I feel angry at the kids, and I'm scared of what I might say when I see them. My stomach turned. I had never written those words. Not in an email, not in a journal, not anywhere. But there was my name at the bottom. Martha Sanders. For a few seconds, I could not move. Then the fear gave way to something stronger. Anger? Not the wild kind. Not the kind that makes you scream. The kind that clears your vision. Richard had not just told lies about me anymore. He had put words in my mouth. He had created a version of me that sounded frightened, unstable, and dangerous enough to make my children pull away. He wanted them to believe that I had become someone they needed protection from. I called Lisa immediately. "Do not respond to Daniel yet," she said after reading the screenshot. "Forward it to me. We need to preserve exactly what he sent you." "But what if he believes it?" "I know," she said gently. "But if you react, before we understand where it came from, Richard will use that too. Take a breath. We're going to look at the facts." That afternoon, Lisa arranged for an independent computer forensic consultant to review the email. His name was Mark Feldman. He was not dramatic, not theatrical, and he did not speak in technical language meant to impress anyone. He simply examined the screenshot, the email headers Daniel had forwarded, and the records Lisa had requested through the legal process. 2 days later, he called us into Lisa's office. "The message did not come from Martha's account," he said. I felt my breath catch. "It appears to have been sent from a secondary address linked to Mr. Sanders's home internet account," Mark continued. "The display name was altered to show Mrs. Sanders's name." Lisa was quiet beside me. Mark clicked through several records on his laptop. "There is more," he said. The email was created from a device that had previously accessed Mr. T-mail, Sanders's financial accounts, and his business records. The IP address and device data are consistent. I stared at the screen. Richard had done it. Not accidentally. Not vaguely. Not because he misunderstood something. He had created false evidence and sent it to our son. "What does this mean?" I asked. Lisa's expression was calm, but her voice was firm. "It means the court will see that he was not simply expressing concern about you. He was manufacturing concern." For the first time since all of this began, I felt the ground beneath me become solid again. I had not imagined it. I had not been confused. I had been targeted. Lisa filed the forensic report with the court and requested that Richard's accusations about my mental stability be reviewed in light of the evidence. She also requested a temporary order preventing either of us from moving money, taking on additional debt, or making major changes to our joint property without disclosure. Richard's attorney responded quickly. They claimed Richard had only forwarded an email he believed was genuine. They claimed he had been worried. They claimed that the address confusion was an unfortunate misunderstanding. But Richard's explanations had begun to sound like what they were excuses. The hearing arrived on a gray Monday morning in December. I wore a dark blue dress and the pearl earrings my mother had given me when I graduated from nursing school. I had not worn them in years. They were small and simple, but they made me feel like myself. Not Richard's version of me. Mine. When I entered the courtroom, I saw Daniel and Emily sitting behind Richard. My heart dropped. Neither of them looked at me. Daniel's shoulders were stiff. Emily sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Richard sat in front of them beside his attorney, looking composed in a charcoal suit. For one painful second, I felt exactly as I had in my worst moments at home. Alone? Misunderstood. Outnumbered. But then Lisa leaned toward me and whispered, "You don't need to win their emotions today. You only need to tell the truth." So that was what I did. The judge began by explaining that the hearing was not a final divorce trial. It was meant to address temporary financial protections, Richard's request for a mental fitness review, and the evidence connected to the disputed email. Richard's attorney spoke first. He stood with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed every sentence. "Your Honor," he said, "Mr. Sanders has been attempting to manage a difficult family situation with compassion. He has witnessed changes in his wife's behavior and was concerned about the impact on their adult children and their shared assets." Compassion. That word nearly made me close my eyes. He continued, "Mr. Sanders has not sought to punish his wife. He has sought support, structure, and guidance during a period of emotional instability." I looked at Richard. He did not look back. Then Lisa stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Your Honor," she said, "this case is not about a husband expressing concern for his wife. It is about a husband creating a written record to make that concern appear justified." She placed a packet of documents before the judge. "The evidence will show that Mr. Sanders took out a $75,000 line of credit against the marital home without meaningful disclosure to Mrs. Blanks. Sanders. It will show that he transferred funds from that line of credit into a business account. It will show that he prepared documents that would have given him authority over Mrs. Sanders's finances and private medical information." Richard shifted in his chair. Lisa continued, "And it will show that after Mrs. Sanders refused to sign those documents, Mr. Sanders used a false email address to send their adult son a message that appeared to come from his mother." The courtroom went silent. Even Daniel looked up. Richard's attorney immediately objected, but the judge allowed Lisa to present the forensic report. Mark Feldman took the stand. He explained the technical findings with simple clarity. The altered display name, the account history, the home internet connection, the device records, the timing. Then Lisa asked one question. "Mr. Feldman, based on the information you reviewed, did this email originate from Martha Sanders's email account?" "No," he said. "Did it originate from a device connected to Richard Sanders's online activity?" "Yes." Richard's attorney tried to challenge him. "Is it possible someone else used that device?" "Anything is theoretically possible," Mark answered. "But the activity log shows the device was also used to access Mr. Sanders' private financial records, his business account, and his personal email. The sequence is consistent with one user." "What does consistent mean?" "It means the evidence points in one direction," Mark said, "not several." I looked toward Daniel. His face had changed. He was no longer staring at the table. He was staring at Richard. And Richard, for the first time, looked uncomfortable. When the judge asked whether Richard wanted to testify, he stood slowly. He began exactly as I expected. He said he had been trying to protect the family. He said he had felt overwhelmed. He said he had seen me become emotional and thought the email might explain why. But Lisa did not argue with his feelings. She asked him about dates. "Mr. Sanders, when did you first become concerned about your wife's mental health?" He gave a date. Lisa held up an email. "This message to your son was sent 3 weeks before that date. In it, you wrote that Mrs. Sanders was becoming unstable and unpredictable. How did you know that before you say your concerns began?" Richard paused. "I was worried before I understood how serious it was." Lisa nodded. "And when did you open the line of credit against the marital home?" He gave another date. "Was that before or after you began telling Daniel and Emily that their mother could not manage financial stress?" He looked at his attorney. "Before," he said quietly. "And did you tell Mrs. Sanders about the line of credit before you withdrew money?" "I handled the family finances." "That was not my question," Lisa said. "Did you tell her?" No. And why did you prepare power of attorney documents naming yourself? Because I believed it would be responsible planning. Did Mrs. Sanders ask you to prepare them? No. Did a physician advise you that she lacked capacity? No. Did any professional tell you she could not manage her own affairs? No. Lisa paused. Then she lifted the screenshot of the false email. Did you send this message to Daniel? Richard's face lost color. No, he said. Did you create the email account that sent it? No. Did you access the device identified in Mr. Feldman's report? I used the computer at home. Did anyone else have access to your personal financial records? He hesitated. No. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier. Lisa stepped closer. Mr. Sanders, did you tell Daniel that this email came from his mother? Richard said nothing. The judge looked at him. Mr. Sanders, you are required to answer. Richard's jaw tightened. Yes, he said. One word. But it changed everything. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of wondering whether my own children could see me. Tired of carrying the pain of a family. Richard had almost convinced me was already gone. Then the judge asked whether Daniel or Emily wished to speak. I had not known they were going to be called. My heart began pounding. Emily stood first. Her hands shook as she walked to the witness chair. She looked at Richard once, then looked down. Lisa approached her with the gentleness she had shown me from the beginning. Emily, did your father speak to you often about your mother during the last year? Emily swallowed. Yes. What did he say? At first, he said Mom was stressed. Then he said she was forgetting things. He said she got upset too easily. Did you see evidence of that yourself? Emily was quiet for a long time. Sometimes Mom was upset, she said finally. But I think she had reasons to be. The words were small, but they mattered. Did your father ever encourage you to ask your mother directly about the things he told you? Emily looked toward Richard again. No. Did he ever tell you what you should feel about her? Her eyes filled with tears. He would say things like, you felt scared when your mom got like that, didn't you? Or, you know, she has always been hard on you. Lisa nodded. And did you feel scared? Emily's voice cracked. I didn't know what I felt anymore. That sentence went straight through me. Not because it hurt, because it was the truth. Richard had not only tried to take my voice, he had made our children question their own. When Daniel took the stand, he looked older somehow. Not in years. In understanding. Lisa asked him about the email. Daniel, what did you think when your father showed you the message? I thought Mom wrote it, he said. Why? Because Dad said she did. Did you ask your mother before believing it? Daniel looked at me. No. His eyes filled, but he did not look away. I should have, he said. I just trusted him. The courtroom was quiet. Then Daniel took a breath. When Mom said Dad had been lying, I thought she was trying to turn us against him. But now, he stopped for a moment. Now I think he was trying to turn us against her. Richard's attorney did not cross-examine Daniel for long. There was nothing useful left to twist. The judge did not announce a final decision that day. Real life is rarely that quick or that simple. But he issued temporary orders. The marital accounts were protected from further transfers without disclosure. The line of credit was placed under review. Richard was ordered to provide complete financial records related to the business account and the money taken from the home equity. The judge also denied Richard's request to label me mentally unfit based on unsupported accusations, and because of the false email, the court referred the matter for further investigation. It was not dramatic. There was no applause, no music, no grand speech. Just a judge reading carefully from his notes. But when he said, "The court finds no basis at this time to restrict Mrs. Sanders's control of her own affairs," I felt my shoulders lower for the first time in months. I was still myself. The court had not given that truth back to me. Richard had never had the right to take it. After the hearing, people began gathering their papers. Richard stood near his attorney, speaking in a low voice. He looked smaller than I remembered him looking, though maybe that was because I was finally seeing him without fear. Daniel and Emily remained near the doorway. I did not rush toward them. I did not demand apologies. I had learned that love cannot be forced, even when it has been wounded. So I waited. Emily came to me first. "Mom," she said. That was all. Just one word. But it was enough to make my eyes fill. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have listened to you." I reached for her hand, not pulling her closer, only offering it. "You were trying to understand," I said. "And someone you trusted made that hard?" She began to cry then. I held her the way I had held her, after childhood nightmares. Not because she was a child anymore, but because some forms of comfort never stop being true. Daniel stepped toward me next. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "You don't have to fix everything today." I told him, "You just have to be honest from now on." He nodded. Then he hugged me. Awkwardly at first, then tightly. And for the first time in what felt like years, my children were not standing beside Richard while he explained who I was. They were standing with me, listening to my own voice. The divorce process continued for months. The financial review revealed that Richard had used part of the money from the home equity line to cover losses in a private investment venture. He had been afraid to tell anyone. Instead of admitting the truth, he had tried to build a story in which I was too unstable to question him. The false email did not disappear into silence either. The investigation moved forward separately, and Richard eventually accepted responsibility through his attorney, rather than force Daniel and Emily to endure a longer public process. There were consequences. Financial consequences. Legal consequences. But the deepest consequence was simpler. Richard had lost the power to define reality for the people around him. The final divorce agreement gave me a fair share of the home's equity and protected my own savings. I moved into a smaller house on the other side of town the following spring. It had a blue front door and a narrow porch with room for 2 chairs. The maple tree was gone. The old white fence was gone. For a while, I thought losing that house would break my heart. But it did not. Because home was never only the walls Richard and I had shared. Home was the place where I could breathe without being corrected. Home was where I could remember something without someone telling me I was wrong. Home was where my children could visit and know that no one would whisper in their ears about what they were supposed to feel. Emily began therapy on her own. Daniel did too. Sometimes they asked me questions about the past. Sometimes we remembered things differently. And when that happened, I no longer rushed to defend myself. I listened. They listened too. We learned that truth did not mean every memory had to be identical. It meant no one person got to own everyone else's memory. One Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after the courtroom hearing, Daniel and Emily came to my new house for dinner. I made roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The same meal I had made on the night Richard first planted doubt at our family table. For a second, as I set the dishes down, I felt nervous. Then Emily looked at me and smiled. "This smells like home," she said. Daniel laughed softly. "Just don't tell Dad I was late to class again." Emily rolled her eyes. And I laughed. Really laughed. Not because everything was perfect. It was not. Healing is not a straight line. Trust does not come back because a judge says the right words. It returns slowly, through small choices repeated over time. But that night, sitting across from my children, I understood something I had once forgotten. I did not need Richard's permission to be believed. I did not need his version of me to be erased before I could reclaim my life. I only needed to stop abandoning myself. If you are watching this, and someone keeps correcting your memories, questioning your feelings, or making other people doubt your character, please remember this. Concern should invite conversation. Love should make room for your voice. And truth does not become less real just because someone repeats a lie calmly. Protect your records. Ask questions. Speak to people you trust. And never confuse forgiveness with giving someone unlimited access to hurt you again. I will always wish Richard had chosen honesty before he chose control. But I no longer carry the responsibility for the choices he made. What I carry now is my dignity. And that is enough. If Martha's story touched you, please like this video, subscribe to Truth and Dignity Stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. What boundary would you protect first if someone you loved tried to rewrite your reality? Your voice may help someone else recognize that they are not alone.